Unmute.
Good evening. Welcome to Everything Matters. So glad to have you here tonight. I like to begin every show with just a little intro about what Everything Matters means and where this kind of came from. So I grew up in the church as a pastor's kid in a very spiritual kind of world. And for me, most of my life growing up was all kind of based around spiritual issues. And so it was read the Bible and pray, and those things are good. And I appreciate those things in my life. But as I got older, as I became a pastor myself, I started to realize just that spiritual part of it wasn't the only thing that was going on in life. There was also not only spiritual needs, but practical needs and emotional needs. And as I became a pastor and started working with people, I realized, wow, God's working through all these different areas. And sometimes it comes through art, sometimes it comes through a discussion, a movie, or a sermon, or all sorts of different things. So the idea for Everything Matters really comes from this idea that everything does matter and that God is in all these different areas and different things. So this place of having discussion about different issues and philosophy and theology and truth and sciences and kind of mesh them all together here tonight. So tonight, I'm excited to have my friend Jim Piper here, my friend Bill Coletti. Thank you guys for being here. And last 2 weeks ago, we talked about legalism and relativism. And if you haven't seen that episode, I encourage you to go back and check it out. We had great discussion, and some of that will even color some of our discussion tonight. But we really want to jump into an issue, a topic, I guess, of grace and truth. And I usually like to talk about this sometimes to kind of get people in the discussion, is talking about sometimes grace versus truth, because I think that's kind of sometimes what's looked at within our society. And really, the premise of this all comes from a scripture, John 1:14. It says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." And that line, full of grace and truth, is so, so important. It's really what John uses to kind of put his premise for a lot of the Gospel of John. And that's a really, really important piece, and you see that play. Oftentimes, we look at grace and truth, especially for me, coming from a pastoral side, growing up as a pastor's kid, there's almost this fight between, I would say, the Grace Church and the Truth Church. And I know that's kind of simplifying some things, but I think I've seen the struggle, and even the struggle, maybe even the debate, as ugly as we've seen a couple of weeks ago, between the Grace and the Truth churches. And so brought you guys in. I'd love to have some conversation with you about this, but you know, I think where we need to start tonight in our discussion is begin to define as much as we can grace and truth to kind of get after that. So for both of you, I'd love to hear how do you explain this concept of grace? We're in this, I would say, very grace kind of centered church. Bill, how do you interact with that issue and that idea of grace?
So for me, grace is selflessness.
Okay.
It's simple selflessness. And it is putting yourself second or third or 100th in the list and really being focused on others, really being focused on the needs of others, really being focused on the emotion of others, the EQ, having a high EQ. I don't think you can have great grace unless you have EQ and really understand
Explain
other
what
people.
EQ means to
It's
you.
your emotional intelligence.
There you go.
Instead of this,
You and I have had that discussion.
You
but
have
on
IQ, but they also have EQ, and this notion of you really have to be able to be tuned in to other people. I think that grace also has a sophistication to it, is that we need to have boundaries in grace. I think some things that we've talked about when helping hurts is that it has to be smart grace.
If you've never read the book When Helping Hurts, go read it tomorrow. It's really, really good.
Great book. Shapes so much of our thinking around missions around here and in lots of different ways. So I think grace is really fundamentally is about this notion of selflessness. I put glove in the grace bucket.
It's in the category, in that soup. Yeah.
And so I think all of those things sort of manifest what it means to be grace and graceful. And one of the ways, so I grew up running political campaigns. And so for a long time, we all articulate American politics on this continuum of left and right, Republican, Democrat, and it's generally a straight line. And people place themselves somewhere on that line, center, left, right, what have you. For me, in a non-spiritual context, in this administration and where we find ourselves now, is there is a new axis off of that straight line, which is the grace axis. And so it is left, right, center, which is the traditional American construct of politics, but there's a straight line that goes straight up the middle, which is the grace axis.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we all need to focus on. So when I think about grace, it's all about selflessness.
That is an interesting. I love you and I think we're in the Dominican Republic.
we're in
You were
Dominican
talking
Republic,
about that
yes.
issue of the grace access that I think you need to write a book on that.
And we need it in politics.
We do.
Because the liberal, conservative, right, left, Republican, Democrat is almost meaningless.
Right.
To me, this election, and Biden is certainly making it about, he's making this a grace election.
Right.
That's what this is about.
Right. In fact, just so you know, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a discussion here about politics, which should be really interesting coming up to our election. Should be good. So when you're talking about grace, there's a lot of practical stuff in there. I think you understand well and embrace the theological side of it too, for sure. But how you went right to this is how it plays out for me, selfless, and I like that. I
Absolutely.
appreciate
it
that.
has to be built in action.
Yeah.
I think grace, if I have grace home alone, that doesn't do very much.
Yeah.
That's where I can live with my truth. I can live with my truth home alone.
Right.
But I have to act out my
And the
grace.
intimacy of your head. And
Exactly. My grace has to be demonstrated to others. And so that's critical.
What do you think about that, Jim?
I agree. I mean, it starts with this. Grace is this undeserved thing that we got from God. It's this. I particularly didn't deserve His grace when He brought me to Him. I deserved the exact opposite, and so it's calling on me to try to treat others with that same grace that God treats me with, which is way more difficult for me than it is for God, who does it for all of us and does it repeatedly and on a daily basis.
So, yeah, I love how you just said that, and I do think what you said about this, that has to play with other people at some point, right? And you kind of get to that too. I mean, if we didn't have anybody else, we wouldn't have a need for grace at all, right?
Well, and grace is what leads you to the intimacy with God, and then that intimacy with God and wanting to know Him better leads you into all these things. I mean, we don't, we don't. It's the difference between doing good deeds just to look good for others and doing good deeds out of that sense of God's love and grace, which He's poured into me, pouring out into my life and how I treat others.
Well, you said something when you first said it about undeserved, and I think typically that's where theologically we end up going most of the time, is this undeserved grace being tagged to the side of me. I don't deserve this, which is a very interesting concept.
Well, and you know my story of how I came to God, so I truly,
give people a little bit of a Reader's Digest of that real quick, because I think it's important in this discussion about your coming to God and the Riverbend and that whole thing.
Well, I was an atheist, raised by atheists, who was an atheist for the first 57 years of my life. I was a divorce lawyer. If you asked me what I did, forgive me, I would have told you I tear asunder what God has joined together.
Yeah.
I mean, literally.
Sure.
And, with all the bit of the pride and arrogance of an atheist.
Right.
I mocked him, I mocked you.
No reverence, yeah. For all, yeah.
Until he brought me to my knees and I needed him, and he came to me and revealed himself to me and set me on a journey of prayer and meditation and knowing him, which after 6 years led me into Riverbend Church at age 63.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was an undeserved grace.
Yeah, so when you say undeserved, that's the tip of the iceberg for you, right?
Yes.
How about not yet recognized? Not yet recognized.
Yes, there's the spin doctor right there. I love that.
I don't like the undeserved.
Right.
Not yet recognized.
And I've cleaned it up. If I told the real story, I would really need bills.
That's why we have a tape delay.
Bill is here to make sure all of us don't say something stupid. You get paid to do, right?
Saying something stupid. So I just said a minute ago, I said grace is what you do to others. And I
Right.
do believe that. I think
Yeah.
grace lives in action. And so I do believe that. And John said something, this undeserved, and we were laughing about that. But I think we need to do a better job of self-love and self-grace
Yeah.
that's there. And I've noticed, John, over the years, and we've not known each
Jim.
other, Jim, over the years.
You're
we-
mixing with I'm talking about the book of John.
My apologies.
Yeah.
Is that we've had that at this touch point is that we talked about keeping score. I think men's Bible study a long time ago. But it's okay to sort of love ourselves and demonstrate grace to ourselves as well as actions to others, which is critical. And then when we talk about grace, we forget about the self-love and the self-care part of grace.
I've actually had an idea at some point. I may have a whole show on this, but the equation that Jesus sets up when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. There's an equation there. And this could be another tangent along another show, but the equation goes like this: if I don't love myself, how then am I supposed to love others and love others well? And so there is a very sacred space of loving who you are and what God has created in you, that you could walk around our society and go, oh wow, there's not a lot of love for who that person is and value for their person is. How in the world are they supposed to love others and that whole thing? So I do think that is another very personal way that grace plays out. And I think it has a lot of relevance. So I love that. I love the discussion. I think at Riverbend, grace is who we are. I mean, we wear that badge like no other. And I think I literally moved to Austin to be a part of this movement of grace and what God's done to that. But I think, in this scripture, we also have this idea of truth. Last week we took some time to really wrestle out legalism and relativism, which have this kind of tangent to. There's not exact opposites, but there's a tangent to them that there's a struggle between those two things, I think. And we get to the relativism side, we definitely are talking about issues of truth and what is truth and how do you define that? Because if we're going to have a discussion here about being full of grace and full of truth, well, what does that look like? You got really practical with grace, which I loved, but how do we define truth? I mean, you're a lawyer. This is what you live in, and I'm really interested for us to have a discussion around that, especially the truth side about how you define truth. Do you have a short way to do that, or is that a long discussion?
It's interesting because in the law, you say I define the law to the best of my ability. Truth is a fuzzy thing in the law. We wouldn't have appeals courts. We wouldn't have judges who disagree. We wouldn't have big fights over who's on the Supreme Court of the United States if the truth was this
simple.
Yeah. And if studying led us to the absolute true conclusion of everything, then we'd all reach the same conclusions. And by the way, the Pharisees would have been Jesus's friends.
Good point.
they were the consummate studier
Right.
of the law. So it's.
Do we equate the law and truth typically in society? I mean, you're breaking that down a little bit harder. Do you think most people, whether you're a Christian in the church world or even outside of it, we put law and truth as like, that's it?
I think people probably expect that to be true.
There's a phrase that has both truth and justice in it. It's the pursuit of truth, or there's some phraseology in jurisprudence that talks about truth. And I think that's our not non-lawyers' naive view.
For sure.
Is that the law is a source of truth.
Right.
But then you dig a little bit deeper to the point that, there's a lot of subjectiveness. There's a lot of interpretation.
And I've told my clients for 30 years, I'm a trial lawyer, and I've told them, generally, I believe the truth comes out. Generally. But who, by the way, who knows what the truth is at the end of the day? Because and the law perpetually tries to seek better ways to figure that out.
Right.
And the law has that same struggle between grace and the truth in it.
But in the law, if I steal a candy bar from the 7-Eleven, I stole the candy bar. That's a truth.
But are we gonna give you grace for that? By the way, can I prove you stole the candy bar, even if you did steal it?
You only stole it if you got caught. According to the law.
I don't know. I mean, I stole the candy bar.
And there
And
will
the guy
be
saw me steal the candy bar.
and there will be some simpler deals. Of course, if we have a video of you stealing the candy bar, and the cop comes out to you upside, because you're gonna. By the way, in this society, you're gonna claim, I forgot to pay for it.
Exactly.
I know you, Bill. That's
Right,
what you're gonna
exactly.
say.
ATM card didn't work.
And what's the classic example of theft with grace from Les Miserables?
Sure.
Jean Valjean with the candlesticks and like, ugh.
And you know, it's everybody's view of the protesters and whether they're justified in to one set of people. The truth is that they're destroying property. To another set of people, it's that they're expressing
Right.
very important views that need to be expressed in dramatic ways.
Does motive play in this? Like if you stole the candy bar because you're hungry and you're trying to feed your family somehow through a
No, I
Snickers
stole
bar.
it. No, I don't think
Okay.
it does. I
Okay,
stole
we're
it.
back to Jean Valjean. Didn't he steal a loaf of bread because he was hungry?
No, I mean, I stole it.
But that's the struggle
Hold
of
the
the
truth
Yeah,
back. Look at-
yeah.
that's the struggle of the law.
Yeah.
Because the law does struggle with that. We try to decide if, let's use not the candy bar, but now let's make you some sort of drug addict. How do we deal with your drug addiction? Do we deal with it with grace, or do we deal with it with hardcore prison?
Sure.
Do we have one set of very legalistic rules, which, and I mean, the federal court system in criminal cases has sort of done this.
Minimum mandatories, absolutely.
That's right. Now they spit out a bunch, and I'm not a criminal lawyer, but they spit out a bunch of stuff, and your
Put it
sentence
into a
is
matrix,
pretty
and you
restricted.
get the number.
Yeah.
And that's a
create a
reaction
policy to that,
to
basically.
when there used to be a lot of discretion and this much greater ability for grace. But there was a problem with that, but yet you'll still hear people say this new system has a problem too because it doesn't have the flexibility for grace.
Right.
And the problem is there'll be in the law, I think, this back and forth forever because we're imperfect judges. I think we're told who the
Because
real
we're still
judge
imperfect, right?
yeah,
So
and so there's this perpetual reaction. You know, you deal with enough people with legal problems that you've seen this too. There's this explosion in the law. I mean, code books that used to be this big are now this big. Is the law better because we've defined what the truth is
is it
more
more
clearly?
true? Yeah.
Lawyers make more money. That's the only positive thing I
Well,
can see out
But
of
is
it.
there, but just a second, but is
Yeah.
there, so I'm thinking of this phrase, truth and consequences. So there is truth. I stole the candy bar. Okay, that is a truth. My consequences, because of my situation, because of my drug addiction, because of my need for my family, because of whatever that comes through in the consequences. The truth is the truth. I stole the candy bar. That's something that was not mine.
I broke the
I
law,
walked
right?
into the store.
Yeah.
I took something that was not mine. All right, so I did that. The grace component and the subjectivity and this relativism of did I steal it or not is not in the truth. It's in the consequences. What happens to me at that point? Oh, he needed it.
How big a way we let the grace play into it. Because two people are going to view that differently.
Yeah.
One person's going to have a great deal of sympathy for you for having stole it, and they're going to believe your story. The other person's going to look at a different set of factors, come from a different place, and they're going to view it differently.
Is that not the role of judges? The role of judges in sentencing phases, usually you have the jury decide, but the judge often is doing the data and saying, well, there was a fact, you did steal it. Here's the extenuating circumstances or the the additional grace factors that mitigate maybe this sentence to this sentence.
But ultimately, that shows the very imperfection of what we do when we apply this to
Yeah.
all the rest of our lives is two different judges do two different things. How is that fair? We know that, that people of certain ethnicities are far more likely to receive the death penalty, obviously, and we've struggled with that, with trying to make clearer laws, brighter lines, clearer ideas of the truth, but yet we don't cure the problem. I mean, we've said don't discriminate against those kinds of things. Those laws go back forever, but they don't
So,
cure the problem.
I'm interested for you because I know you've worked. I've talked about this. How you've worked elections, and part of your job and what you do is you end up managing when things go awry for people. I mean, I imagine you have to try to figure out truth in all these things on many different levels. So is kind of the I stole the candy bar kind of analogy for you, does that play out for you in those political realms, in those public realms of what you're doing? Like you have to get down to that. However you end up figuring out how you can communicate those things.
So one of the most important things that I'm most proud of is I represented a young man, and lawyers and I use a lot of the same vocabulary, but we
Right.
talk about it in different contexts. But worked with a young man. Some people may know him. University of Oklahoma. And he said a racist chant by his fraternity, and so said all the bad words that you're not supposed to say. They're
Right.
actually abhorrent words. And he did it on Saturday night on his way to a social fundraiser or social event for his fraternity. And so by Sunday night, I was on my way up to Oklahoma because his family had retained me to do that. And it was true what he did. It was a videotape. It was
Right.
clearly true of what he did. But that was not his truth. That was not that family's truth. This was a 19-year-old kid who made a big, bad mistake. And so we were able to work with him on both publicly and personally a journey of redemption and a
Right.
journey of apology and a journey of learning. The chant or the thing they said referenced lynching. Lynching is not really taught we grew up in Texas, not really taught in a lot of public schools, in the context and the horrificness of lynching. And so I think that I always make value judgments on the folks that I work for.
Yeah.
And there are clients that I won't work for
Right.
because they are not full of truth. And there's no way that I can spin that. There's no way that I can change that
Right.
situation. And as I've grown older and frankly been a little bit choosier, that line has become a lot brighter.
Yeah.
But it is all rooted in truth.
Right.
And I think that I do use truth as what is the truth? I can minimize consequences. But I really believe that people did wrong things.
Don't you try to shove people towards the truth?
Sure. Or sometimes try to show them something else to look at. Not a different truth. The Trump administration's bastardized that, but
Right.
a different version of this is how this went down, and here are the things I'd really like for you to look at. So there's this construct of so truth is critically important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious that we've been talking about it in a legal context,
Yes.
which views judgment. What about science? Can we agree on truth in a science context? Is the Earth not flat?
Well, yeah.
Can we just agree? If we want to find a truth we can all bear hug, can we bear hug that?
Well, see, that's what's interesting is, and I don't know if that's where our own brokenness, our own egos, our own desires to value ourselves somehow that always ends up getting muddy, right? Like it would. Yes, it seems like it would be easy to think for us to say the world is not flat, but yeah, we have a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
I mean, probably a bunch of flat earthers who are like, "What are you talking about right now, Aaron? You're messing with me."
Yeah.
Probably getting comments on that. Who knows? But I think that's part of the point for me is that even scientifically, if we want to go so scientifically, we're still humans. We're still broken and messed up and have bad perceptions of certain things that we can even still be looking at something that's pure truth and still go, you're or whatever. And still look at that and go, no, science isn't true.
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean, that's the debate that's raging on
Oh, sure.
in a lot of our Facebook things and
I
Instagram
don't
things.
want to be a part of it, but yeah, it's raging and it's
Yeah,
going
it
on because I
is,
think
it is.
there are some truths that are true.
For sure.
And doesn't every generation view its science as the ultimate truth about science? And doesn't every generation have a new view? I mean, I still remember a time in, I want to say, the 70s or the 80s when the scientists were convinced we were entering into an ice age. On the front of Time magazine, and it was the general view of the scientists. And ice was going to descend through Canada and into Minnesota, and we'd be safe down here in Texas, but except for all the Yankees who'd have to come down and live with us. And,
He's a Yankee
and I
reference
don't,
in there.
California.
and by the way, before anybody accuses me of not believing in global warming,
Yeah.
don't go there.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that a lot of these things that we think are true, later on we change our views on them. I mean, haven't you changed your views on a lot of what you
Oh,
thought was
absolutely.
true?
Oh,
and
without
isn't-
question.
Yeah.
And you will continue to.
No, without question. And those are back to those human things. Those are judgments. And that almost fits on that political ideology.
Yeah.
A lot of my thoughts have changed and refined in that context. But I still am starved for real truth.
You search for it, don't you? I think I do.
Yeah.
I think this the constant journey that I'm on is like, what is true? I mean, when we're talking about science, why do only 4 out of 5 dentists agree that this is the right thing to do? You know? I mean,
Yeah, good point.
like,
Good
okay,
point.
you're all scientists supposedly. Why aren't 4 or 5 of you? So
What if that other guy's right?
what's wrong with that other guy? Is he,
Right.
out smoking weed and he just
Right.
doesn't agree? I don't know what's going on with that. But yeah, I mean, many times for me, I think I shared this when we had the Bible study earlier talking about this issue. Like I was always playing music in bars and getting to know people. And it was still my favorite things is go play music and then sit down and have a beer and sit and talk with someone. And they're like, what do you do? Do you play music for a living? No, I have 4 kids. This is not pay for 4 kids. I'm a pastor. You're a what? You're an effing pastor. What are you doing here?
Right.
And immediately they're like, well, I don't believe in God. And here's why, because I can't handle this and this. And then inevitably we would get into some sort of conversation about what is true. And is God true? And is these things true? And, that's where we kind of landed that conversation last week a little bit about this idea of truth. If someone says, well, I think this is true, and you think this is true, and this scientist thinks this is true, I ask the people, I say, okay, so who owns truth? And they would always, almost always say, well, we own truth. Like, my truth, I own it, and this, I go, well, if my truth is to walk in this bar and just shoot everybody, is my truth better than your truth at that point? I mean, what's really true? And they go, oh, wait, we got to have a discussion about that. And so that's where I end up coming to this idea that for me, I don't think humans own truth. I think when God said, later on in John 14:6, he says that he's the way, the truth, and the life. Like that's for me, the only pure, unscathed truth is what I see in creation and in Jesus for me. And, but everything else is somewhat fuzzy. For me, when you said it's fuzzy, there's a lot of
But it's in our
Facebook,
buzz.
Instagram, Pinterest, everything is filled with us wrestling with what is true.
Sure.
It's
Go
in
ahead.
our DNA though to want that answer.
Absolutely, I want it.
From little bitty children. What do your children always ask you? Why questions? Daddy, why is the sky blue? Why is this? Why is that? That it's just in our DNA to want answers to stuff, and then you add a little bit of education where we think we're really smart.
Right.
And now we're really supposed to figure it out. And by the way, and then we're competitive, so I do think my truth is better than your
Absolutely,
truth.
and I'm competitive too. I'm gonna, that's kind of where we are.
And so it's frustrating sometimes to not figure it out or to think you have the truth and then you're reading something else and now you're questioning what your view of the truth is. And you ask what the law is, and young lawyers would ask me these questions that are in some of those gray areas, and they would say, what's the answer to this legal question? And my answer would be, and this is this is the truth, who do we represent? You tell me who we represent, and then I'll tell you what the answer is.
Yeah.
And don't we do that with the truth sometimes? We define the truth as what we want the answer to be, sometimes because that makes our own life easier or better or
sure.
justifies our own existence and our own behavior.
Well, I've heard, most of my life, when we talk about the everything matters part of it and kind of what's influenced me, I think I've heard most of my life, well, the Bible's true.
Yeah.
And so it's the Word of God and these things, and I believe that, but I've also watched many theologians and many people who I love and people who I respect argue about what is true in that. There's obviously some hopefully some centerline basics, but there's a lot of stuff there that we end up still searching, as we say, still wrestling, going, what is this? What does this mean? It's kind of this endless. If you look at the arc of theology and how we wrestle with those things, the things that I think about the Bible and truth in the Bible now from when I was 21, 22 is like vastly different.
So is that, let me put words in your mouth, is that erosion? It was
No.
a 15-pound block of truth when you were a child, and now it's a 12-pound block of truth. And when you're 70, it's going to be a 5-pound block.
No, you know what I think it is, and I've wrestled with this a lot. I don't know if it's an erosion. It's almost more the opposite way of erosion, because for me, I told some people in the staff today that I probably have more church PTSD than anybody I know. If there was a category for church PTSD, I'm telling you right now, I'm kicking everybody's butt. I got that right. So I think for me, when I look at what we talk about as truth, typically has really, if you really boil it down, it's come out as policy. Okay, we call it policy. So what I've noticed, and I've seen a lot of hurt and pain throughout the church, like deep, painful things around some heavy issues. And I think what people end up doing is they end up creating policy, and good policy for that matter, to protect people. And you can see more hurt brings more and more policy. So we have a church that, and I say big churches in society, that where you're seeing places like Riverbend push against that policy to some extent, and say there's grace here and there's all this. There is truth in this too. We got to wrestle that out. But there's been so much hurt for so long that it's easy. Creating policy now says this is how we all are not going to get hurt. Because if I can just say here's the laws and here's the rules, then Jim's okay and Bill's okay and I'm okay. And we're not going to hurt each other. We're not going to do those things that hurt each other anymore. So I think maybe when I was younger, I would have looked at it as an erosion, like you said, but as I've lived life more, I realize those basic truths are always there. I think we end up, just like the Pharisees sometimes, adding to all those things policy and ways of doing it that ends up call it truth. We put the label on it as truth because it's our easiest way to implement and hold that line, if that makes sense.
Isn't that sort of the message of Job when all these horrible things happen to him, and first the three friends come and then the fourth, and you can tell they all have a strong biblical foundation because there is a lot of truth in what they say, although they twist off and ultimately do more damage with their truth than they do good, and they all argue, and he comes back, and at the end, what's God's explanation to him about why it happened? Boy, it's my business and you won't understand it, is basically what God says. And that's kind of my truth.
Don't mess with me, I got this, right?
And then Jesus does the only thing that we need to perpetually do. The very last thing he does is he repents.
Right.
And I guess sort of my truth is that I'm less sure of the truth when I was younger.
Really?
I'm more flexible. I had absolute truths and things I believed about the death penalty, and they become fuzzier as I've
Yeah.
grown older, and they may change again.
So let me
And
ask you
so-
both this then. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Kevin.
I wanted to just pop in here for a second. Here's a couple of quotes that I wanted to get you guys' feedback on it, because I think what you were alluding to, what the church seems to do, what your experience has seemed to brought out, is a couple of these quotes. And Jake, if you can bring them up. Only trust in the perfect love of God is able to overcome our persistent fears and give us the courage to engage in free theological work.
Yeah.
The grace of God is indeed a mystery in which men and women are invited to participate rather than an intellectual puzzle that they are to solve. So I know that's a lot of things, but what I gather out is that what we're doing here, what we do in the context of community and in our faith, is we're not afraid to dive into these things. And sometimes it's a process. Sometimes it's a loosening and a lifting of the weight. Sometimes it's adding weight on in a different way. Sometimes you get like, I've had the same experience. I've loosened up on a lot of things that I thought were concrete, but I've also become more concrete with some things that I was much looser
I agree.
on.
Yeah.
So, but we do that in the context of community, and we're not afraid to do it knowing that there's a mystery of grace. But this is what we do.
And part of grace is us accepting a view that I may have concrete feelings about, that you may have a different set of concrete feelings about.
So we have these two things though. We're always struggling kind of to define, because these are big, big concepts, grace and truth. So even though they're hard to define, is there places where these grace and truth really are in conflict?
Well, if you look up grace and truth and you Google it, you know what the first thing that comes up is, don't you?
What comes up?
It's the gay, lesbian, transgender issues, and they're struggling with grace
And truth.
and truth
Yeah.
on those issues. Isn't that something that you could do
Oh,
a
absolutely.
big old, and isn't that, and probably where you fall on your spectrum of truth on those issues may have more to do with how full your grace bucket is today as opposed to how full your truth
Truth
bucket
bucket is,
might
yeah.
be today.
Yeah, that's a great point. So go back to the John where you started with
Yes.
the John, and in the second half of it, it talks about with grace and truth. Read a couple words before that.
So
Yeah.
the lines, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
So full of grace and truth.
100% each. That's
Okay, so that's
the
where I was getting ready to
context.
ask you.
Yeah.
Is it 100% each or is it a 50-50 cocktail?
I think it's 100% each.
Okay, that's where I think it's 100%.
Which I prefer my cocktails 100, 100.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. That's basically a shot and a chaser is basically what that is.
I
my
believe
preference.
theologically that's what it's saying, but I also know that in my human intellect and understanding, just messes with me, because in my brain, how can it be 100% of both?
Yeah.
But I think the part of that for me is the wrestling and the journey of these two things. Or I do start to see the 100% of the both, but practically it's hard. It doesn't make sense, but that's theologically what it's saying.
Right.
Is it's all grace and all truth all the time.
Let's go straight to the point with Jesus, because we always go back to the Jesus part. We're talking.
Right.
We're using John. Was Jesus all grace, or did he bring the hammer down as well?
Well, that's where I think, I say this line often to people: you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Right? I mean, so John uses this throughout his gospel as kind of the 100%. I mean, John 8, you see, we just talked about it today in some of our things. You see Jesus in this setting where the adulterous woman comes to him, and Jesus, does all this writing in the sand and all these things, and then he, after the whole thing, he says, "Go and sin no more." So he has all this stuff playing out in there. So I think John uses this as a premise, and then through telling stories and through telling parables and his perception of how he saw Jesus, he's trying to portray both those things going on through the Gospel of John. And now,
But don't you think there's a lot of people that story? Let's dig into that a little bit. That one's used quite often. The woman caught in adultery, and the writing in the dirt, and the he who is without sin cast the first stone.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, there's something about that word sinless. I think it's not used very often in the Bible, nowhere else, that particular word.
Yeah.
So Jesus is making a point. He is sinless, cast the first stone. Everybody leaves eventually.
The oldest to the youngest leave.
And then who's here to condemn you? No one, Lord. Then neither do I.
Right.
And a lot of people, I got to tell you, I'm around a lot of people that stop right there.
Right.
And the go and sin no more part is pretty powerful.
Right.
It's pretty powerful to say that's the 100% grace and truth part.
Right.
And I think if we're saying that, there's also another story of Jesus healing a man at the pool of Bethesda. And there's another instance where he goes, hey, stop it. Stop what you're doing. Stop sinning.
Right.
And so that gets into the whole, we had this discussion a little bit, my Jesus is this, my Jesus is that.
Right. Yeah.
You know, my Jesus is liberal, mine's conservative, mine's radical.
We end up being like the guys on Ricky Bobby. Dear baby Jesus.
Dear baby Jesus.
My Jesus is with me at the
£6,
Skinner
£7,
concert, right?
It's like, which Elvis do you like? Do you like Fat Elvis or you like Gold Sequin Elvis?
Sequin, man. Bring on the sequin, man.
The one on the stamp.
For sure. But I think, Kevin, what that gets to, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but it also more of that when we look at that scripture and how we interpret it says more about us than it does even that scripture. I think how we perceive that and how you can dig into each one of our own stories and our own experiences and our own intellect, and that we're perceiving that a certain way. Now, for sure, Kevin, I think there is a group of people that would be stronger on one side and one that's stronger on the other side, and you're going to see that pull of that back and forth. But I think John is still trying to communicate, or at least get us to wrestle with this idea that is the spirituality is 100% both of them.
Yeah. So a lot of this, I'm thinking about that the two 100% is what you clearly said, and that's helpful. Is it that our grace improves our truth, and our truth refines our grace?
That's Gail Gibson saying some of the same things. She says,
Well, she's
from the
very
age-
smart.
She
I've
is
always
smart.
liked Gail.
20 to 7, it's not erosion but purifying. She believes there's
So that's where I was going to go. So Gail, thank you for that. And so if I mentioned back to that erosion, I talked about a rock and did it erode over time.
Right.
So I think there's this dude somewhere in the Southwest just found like a big diamond somewhere. I heard it in the news.
It was in Arkansas.
Arkansas.
It
So
was
this-
at like a campground.
Okay, so this guy finds this diamond. Let's say it's the size of a brick.
Yeah.
I have no idea how big it was. It's the size of a brick. That diamond is going to get cut and shaped and refined. It's going to get polished, and it's going to be a lot smaller.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the thing the dude found in the dirt is the nascent early truth, with grace, it's going to get shaped and formed and polished and turned into a beautiful stone that when we think of
Right.
as a diamond. It's the grace that was carving it and shaping it and perfecting it and making it the beautiful stone. And so I think what Gail's talking about is that refining.
Yeah.
So that's a diamond. It looks like a big turd right
Right.
now, but through grace, through time, through the skill, through great conversation,
Yeah.
it's going to become a big diamond.
I'm going to go the exact opposite way.
See, I would too.
Okay.
Raised in a certain way that I was, where there was just, I was the big old diamond in the ground, do whatever you want to do. I was refined through truth. Very liberal upbringing, do whatever you want.
It's not your journey.
No,
Yeah.
totally opposite.
Totally opposite journey.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
see, mine was more grace coming first, and then
Finding truth.
finding truth through the Bible, wanting to understand better this relationship and get in deeper into this relationship, and then just experiencing this incredible joy in the Word, and then and then the two begin to work together
Yeah.
because that if anything that pours the grace on.
Right.
Be-
That's the way
because-
I experience it.
And then, but there is still always this little bit of, I
So
do
then
think
let's
they
use our
wrestle.
grace and accept both of those are true. And we'll just, the
That's
Kevin
my-
example.
That's my 100-100 cocktail.
Exactly. So both
beautiful.
of those examples are truth.
Yeah.
Okay. So the stone, or the whatever pre-diamond stone is, whatever that thing is, that lump, maybe that's the us, and God is shaping us with both truth and grace.
Well, I
So
think
it's the stone. So we're arguing the axis that we come to it
Right.
at, but it is the stone is who we are.
I think for me, it's still about a journey. I think if you look at the whole of the journey, both of Kevin and I, even though I may have started more on the truth side of it and found more comfort and even refining in the grace, there still ends up being an yin and a yang that lands us here at the same place at the same time, where Kevin maybe started with more on the grace side of it, but the truth came in his life too. There's still that, there's this balance of these two things. What I like the idea of, if you and I were holding onto a rope,
Exactly.
and we were both holding at this thing as tight as we can, putting our weighting into it. That's the tension that I think this grace and truth
Yes.
conversation creates. But if you were just to let
Let
go,
go.
now I lose all my bearings, and I
Absolutely.
have for either grace or for truth. So I mean, like my premise is, and kind of our discussion is, I think they're intrinsically connected together.
Yes.
I just, throughout society, whether it's law, whether it's in theology, and science, all this other, I think these things are intrinsically connected together, but it's not an event, it's a journey.
Yes.
And I think that's where typically I get a lot of well-meaning Christians who are looking for the list of what truth is and the list of what grace is. And it's, as we've talked about here, I think it's fuzzier than that. I think it's more of a, I used an example before when we talked about a synthesizer, of putting all the information into the synthesizer, and that out of that we're synthesizing grace and truth through the timing in our lives, through the experience, through the context of the people we're with, to what's going on even within society. I mean, we're in this context right now about incredible divisiveness. We're going to get in that later on in the next conversation. That is coloring my tension of this grace and this truth stuff right now.
Absolutely.
It's on my mind. It's on your mind. We've all kind of been talking about
Right.
that.
Well,
So
there's also the issue, I think, of speaking the truth in love. We say that so often. As parents, we have to deal with that. But there's also just sometimes, other believers, the tension of that and the delicate balance of doing that well. So grace, applying grace, again, when you have to just say, that's wrong. I'm sorry, you've crossed a boundary.
yeah, you hit your sister, and that's not going to happen, right? Like that's where it gets truth, right?
And maybe even in a more adult sense, I guess the word might be accountability. There might be other ways to express
Right.
it, but there are times where we have to be a little bit more direct,
Right.
and less just like, whatever, you're forgiven, grace, grace, grace. At some point, that truth and love. And so, what's that like for you guys to have to apply those? Have you had any stories in your life where you had to just, man, I got to go do this. I got to apply the truth and love, or grace and love.
Oh,
and-
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, you probably have to have that every day in court, right?
And there really is, that's where the real tension can be, how much of this is, how do I approach this person? Most of the time, if you've had an affair, for example, you already know it's wrong. You already know, if you're a Christian, that you know what the Bible says about it. I really don't need to tell you that.
Right.
It's a little bit like telling your 16-year-old a bunch of the stuff we tell them not to do. They already know.
Should I stop doing that?
Yeah. All of us who are raising
But
teenagers.
how you do that? I mean, isn't that why our prayers are so filled with "Help me with this problem and how to deal with it, Lord," because there is that tension between grace and truth, and how much do I deal with this? Is this my problem to deal with, or is this yours? How big a role do you want? Because, if you're in the kind of professions, for example, that Bill and I are in, you think of yourself as a problem solver.
Yeah.
It's a natural tendency
Absolutely.
for me to believe that I ought to solve people's problems. And I know for me, when I was first becoming a Christian and trying to figure out how to turn, my will and myself over to God on a daily basis, and I was having a real hard. I knew I had to do this, but what does this mean, God? And I was really praying about it. And then this problem came up in my family with an individual who I needed to talk to about behavior, or thought I did, and I was waiting for God's help on it. And I prayed one morning and prayed the next morning and was waiting for God's help on it. And then that second evening, I talked with my wife, and the problem had been solved. And sometimes God doesn't need my help with every
Exactly.
problem too.
Right.
And so there is that tension. I have a hard time with it. I've come to believe that because you have to balance it too. It's not my role to judge people.
That's the grace side. I think the more you interact with truth, how much grace you need. I mean, it just goes back and forth with me all the time with that kind of thing.
Can I deliver my truth to you if you've had an affair with a sense of grace and
You
understanding?
keep looking at me, Jim.
Well, it's just,
I think you asked the question, so
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I mean,
Kevin, you're right. I think that, and the way I think about it, the way I started, is that grace is being in service of others, and our element of truth is that we have to know right from wrong, because part of that service is fixing wrongs. We're solving wrongs. Okay, so there's an element of that. There's also a truth that I can't help you if you won't help yourself. And I need boundaries. And if you're going to suck me down, I think this is where you were going, you're going to suck me down, that's a truth. Okay? And I can't let that happen to me, my family, my career, my whatever, on your journey. I can love you, I can grace you, but I don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But I'll be there when you poke your head back up, and I'll be there to try to help you. But that's just boundaries,
sure.
which I think is a truth.
Yeah.
And so that's how grace and truth fit together. I want to solve and serve your problems because I think there's an opportunity there, but it is not infinite, and that is informed by what I know to be true, that's not the way it works psychologically, but it's also true that I can't let that happen to me.
yeah.
And this is the oxygen mask analogy on an airplane that
Yeah.
was recently heard about, which is, we've all heard it for 100 times. You got to stay healthy with those boundaries to help other people the next
Right.
time.
Otherwise, you can't help them.
In 12 steps, if you're the sponsor that gets pulled under, well, you're no
You're not
good.
helping anybody.
Absolutely.
If I could tell you how many
and
times
sponsors are exceptional.
how many times people have
truth
come
and
to my
love.
office with their son or their daughter or their family member looking for me as the pastor to fix it. And I have this conversation maybe once a month of I will do everything I can to help so-and-so. But they have to decide if they're ready to work on this.
Right.
It's a truth.
Yeah.
I've tried many,
Yeah.
many times with as much grace and with as much love and care that I think as a pastor should put into those things. And, I find a little bit my own identity and value in doing those things, which is a whole nother mess. But I do enjoy that. I feel called to that, but I've realized as a truth, all of that grace and all of that love and the mercy and that help and that selflessness, as you've talked about, is somewhat worthless if that person does not recognize the truth of what's going on in their own life
Without question.
and not willing to say, I got to do something different. You understand this deeply with the addict side of it, right?
That's the classic example of where grace doesn't really always benefit people. Sometimes people need to suffer the consequences of their own behavior so that their behavior will be changed, because with alcoholics and addicts, have to hit bottom. And if you keep people from hitting bottom, in those communities, the two hardest people to save are the very, very poor, because they don't have resources, they don't have ways, they can't get the help. But then, oddly enough, the very, very rich,
Yeah.
because they have all these monies and things which keep them from losing their house. They don't need their job.
Right.
That's
They
it.
have people that can take care of them, so they just drink and drug
What- yeah,
themselves to
that's-
death.
But can you raise the floor? They have to hit rock bottom, granted, but can we use our grace to lift it up 6 feet?
I love that idea.
Can we, do they have to hit that, do they have to hit that real, you said bottom and dropped your hand way
Almost
down.
always bottom.
Bottom is
Can I
different.
raise it up a little bit?
Bottom is different for
No,
everybody, though.
No, I believe my hand can be there for you when you're down there.
Yeah, but can you raise up, can we raise the floor?
My experience in this is every time that's done, they're not going to change.
In AA, they will ask you very early on, are you through
done?
drinking? Are you done? And
Yeah.
if you hesitate, they'll say, well, just go out there and come back when you are.
They literally tell you, go okay, grab another drink.
Because
Which sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But it's a part of what goes on in that.
and you know and if
If I can just interject, a lot of times that raising of the bottom is, yeah, I'll give you another $10. I'll give you another night to stay here. I'll give you this or that, and that's just perpetual.
Sure, but I don't want to go off too far on a tangent,
Yeah.
but think about particularly substance abusing women, crack babies, substance abusing women that are pregnant and therefore going to have children. Rock bottom is not that moment. Rock bottom is when the court takes that child away from them.
Right.
That's a pretty deep rock bottom. Can we raise the floor a little bit and say, go into treatment, and we're going to use the carrot and stick of you get to keep your child in treatment to raise the floor a little bit. So I'm thinking of
I have no
interventions
idea.
that are smart.
the legal system is sort of trying to do
some of
that
that,
right
right.
now. That's why they're doing drug courts, and that's why they're trying to meld grace with truth and
exactly.
punishment and consequences. But again, I think what they're discovering is that there has to be a healthy balance of grace and that handout, this handout with one hand, club in it
Right.
with the other, and
I just wanted to mention real quick before I forget, this is kind of important. There's a hashtag that's trending right now.
Yeah.
Thanks to Todd Mears. Anybody want to guess what it is?
What is it?
Bill Coletti fan.
Of course.
And I've also got another quote from Brian Rawson. He's gonna add another metaphor. We've got the potter and the clay, all these different metaphors for how God shapes us, and then we have the diamond. His is, as river rocks are smooth because of abrasion as they travel over a riverbed for millennia, so too are we smoothed out and sanctified by our experiences, many of which are the difficulties of the human experience. Philosopher Brian Rawson.
Philosopher Brian
Wow,
Ryson.
deep,
So
deep thoughts.
here's where I'd like to kind of steer us a little bit. I mean, we just spent, this is fascinating and wonderful, and I hope it's good for people that are watching. If you're just joining us, we're talking about grace and truth. It's been a great discussion. I think it's obvious that this is a long, difficult conversation. I mean, we're three, four guys here sitting here talking about this. I see this, and maybe I'm wrong. I see the Christian world particularly is probably more where my expertise is, obviously. I see them going to extremes on this issue of grace and truth. I don't see, and you can, tell me you think I'm crazy on that, but and I may be, heightened of aware of that because of my experience of what I say church PTSD. But my perception is that churches are extreme on each side. That typically, some may find themselves a little bit more in the middle. We don't see something really purely both. I mean, I think we're trying to figure that out at Riverbend, but that's my perception. And if that's true, if you think that's true, then why do you think we end up in that extreme as churches? Because, and I'm asking you because I've wrestled with this a lot in my life as a pastor and seeing, because the people outside the church are looking at that.
Yeah. So I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah.
I think there is riches in the niches. And I think that is in a marketing context or in a professional specialization context. And Jim knows this. You can be a general litigator. You'll have an okay career as a general litigator, whatever the
Right.
heck that means, or I could do PR. The richness, and that's in an economic context,
Right.
is in the niche. I'm going to do highly complicated divorces. And that's my niche. And I'm going to be the best at that.
Right.
It minimizes the friction of business development. Or I'm exclusively going to do crisis communications. Extrapolating that into a church context, I'm going to stake out a camp,
Right.
left or right, because I'm going to be the best at that niche,
Right.
whatever it is. I don't subscribe to that because I think we are trying to camp somewhere
Right.
in the middle. But even with that, we have picked a niche that is this middle niche.
Right.
We've actually said that that's a clear articulation. So just to keep that, be provocative with your conversation, the reason why we've gone to these camps
Yeah.
is because I think there's the riches and the niches, because people's attention span is shorter than a goldfish, because attention span is shrinking everywhere,
Right.
and people need that simple
Yeah.
niche. Okay, and so if you need the best automotive guy that works on Italian cars, go to Mario. He's
Right.
the guy, as opposed to go to Jim, who's just really talented at fixing cars.
Right.
I'm probably going to go to the specialist. And so I
Wow.
think there's riches and
That's
niches.
really
That's
interesting.
brilliant.
What I'm hearing in that too, I guess I should ask, are you saying in an ecumenical manner that that's every church is serving a need, and is that a good thing? So this one does it this way. We actually had this discussion today.
Yeah.
Would you say that it's a good thing that some churches are going to go after social justice as their 100% thing? And they're like, we're not going to really disciple. We're really not going to do much of the attracting new people that maybe aren't aware of who God is. We're just going to another church is going to go, you know what? We love that speaking in tongues, raise your
Totally.
hand,
Right.
Pentecost. That's who we. So in that context, specialization, rich in the niche.
Riches and the niches. Absolutely.
Do you think that's a good thing? And I'm asking everybody, all three of you.
Yeah, so-
and
so-
everybody online too.
So let me take it in a professional context, and then we can talk about it in a church context. I have taken ground in a very specialized area of public relations, in a very specialized area of communications. And I am remarkably generous, graceful, when clients come to me and say, well, can you help me do this? No, I can't, but Mary can. She's excellent at that. And I am generous, and I think that's grace.
Right.
Because I'm really, really good at that. I know the legal community is very, very good at that. You are really good at this thing. You want to go into this together, or I'm going to refer this business out, and there's economic transactions
Right.
that work that way. I don't often see that in churches. There's this weird hyper competition. There are far extreme churches that like to come around and protest and do things in communities. It's easy to disparage that church, but my grace posture is if somebody's finding hope there, maybe that's okay.
Right.
I hate it. It's ugly. It's weird.
I'm telling you, I had to go there eventually too.
Yeah.
I'm totally
But if
with
they're
you.
finding hope, and I'm hoping not being too abstract,
No.
but I hope if they're and if that scratches their itch on Sunday, more power to them.
Just
Right.
another example, in case we're being too abstract, but there are churches that refuse to have instruments in their worship service.
Right.
Sure.
They
There's all
it's just
sorts of flavors
all
of this,
acapella.
yeah.
Totally.
Well, that's just like, what the? I couldn't imagine that world.
Yeah.
But it works for
A couple of
some
musicians,
people.
we struggle with that.
And there's some, let's just be generous, there's on the other side that just have very little substance, it feels like to me. There's no
Yes.
root, there's no rock.
Again, we're being very vague.
We're being very vague.
But that group of people,
Yeah.
if they're finding hope, meaning,
In the blades
community,
of
all that
grass.
stuff,
Knock it out. That's great.
what do you think about that, Jim?
Well, isn't that the beauty of what God does with everything?
Yeah.
Is He paints it in this huge tapestry of colors, and just like we talked about, did you find grace first or the truth first? What's everybody finds it differently. How does
Yeah.
God talk to you? He talks to all of us differently. I think He creates all of this because we're somehow, better as a collective group when we have that diversity of
Yeah.
thought. I mean, the problem is, of course, as a society, we're wanting to stamp out that diversity of thought with anybody who doesn't believe in us.
Right.
Sadly.
But but
Incredible
and,
lack of grace in our society about that.
and
Right
you know,
now,
and
right?
some of it is, churches. And y'all have way more experience with them. I have one church, just a handful of years. I mean,
It's a good deal, Jim.
Well, I picked a good one.
You picked a great church.
But
Stay
but you
pure.
know but
Stay
you know
golden.
but you look at them. You
You're
want
a
a young
diamond.
church, you get a young pastor. You got a young pastor, you'll get a younger church. It's just kind of my sense of it is a
Right.
reality where you place your
Does
church.
our pastor listen to this? Our senior pastor?
Well, he's
Yes,
young at
sometimes.
heart. He's young.
Yeah, I mean, but there it is, yeah.
Where you place your church is going to have a lot to do with you label. So I think it is niches, and and as you're talking about it, how does somebody like me walk into a church? He's heard my story.
Yeah.
I'm praying. I'm not a Christian. I'm praying for about 6-7 years, praying and meditating every morning. I'm on this spiritual journey. And he's dropped Christians into my life, and I'm aware I'm heading this way. And one Sunday morning, in my prayers, God just tells me you're going to church today,
Yeah.
and so I pick a church, and I decide when I'm driving to church, okay, I don't know what it means to be a Christian, but I'm on the spiritual journey with God. I'm now going to be a Christian. I'm going to go to about 5 or 6 churches. This is important because it's not whether I go to church; it's which church I pick, and so. So there has to be a path for somebody like me.
Right.
Well, obviously, a church like Riverbend is a church full of grace where I can feel very comfortable. They're not going to scare me too much. They'll send you to the groups and scare you with the word. but Dave's not going to scare you
Right.
too awfully much on Sunday, and it's going to be a very loving, accepting
Yeah.
place for people to be, and so it attracts somebody like me. There could be other people who need that other kind of church.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
and hopefully, if I make it, their room will be next to mine in heaven.
But we'll all-
We'll all be in the same place.
And so you just outlined a wonderful articulation for this wide cornucopia of churches. Let's have lots of different choices, okay? But when you're in a church, you want it to be the Amazon. You want everybody to shop there because you think it's this amazing, Amazon.com, you think it's this amazing place and you want everybody to shop there. But in one side of our mouth, we're saying, but no, we want a place for everybody to land, but I really want them to land here at my place.
I might say, Bill, there may be some Christians you want to land at another church.
Absolutely.
But the
Absolutely.
Amazon church, I'm not so sure is a good idea. I'm going to try to bring in another quote for this. Jake, you ready with that? Theology is the continuous process of inquiry that's prompted by both the surprising grace of God and by the distance between the promise of God's coming reign on the one hand and our experience of the brokenness of human life on the other.
Yeah.
It is an activity in which all members of the community of faith participate in appropriate ways. So again, it sounds like you're bringing this back around to this is all us working together on this. Our experiences are
That's a beautiful quote.
pulling and pushing the truth and the grace, going back and forth and battling. It sounds beautiful to me.
So if you don't cite those, are you just writing those yourself?
Actually, I've got that. I do have the citation down. This is from I started seminary a couple of weeks ago, and so this is from one of my books.
He's emailing me at night. What do you think about this one? This is really
It's
been
study
good.
is good.
And I'm not sure anybody is for the Amazon church, but maybe they are.
Well, I
Well-
think there are people that want to have. I think
that's-
there's a metric in church.
For sure.
Everybody likes butts and seats.
Yeah, absolutely.
My church is a big church.
Yeah.
But it's the weird Amazon, Walmart, Home Depot thing that you love, but then you hate. It's a
Yeah.
weird push.
I'm not saying it's
We
my
can't,
desire.
we can't name churches, I understand, but there are some churches like that if we think about it.
Yeah.
I have actually not met one. They're still sort of in one. Well, there's many camps, but there is something that I think. I could be
Well,
wrong.
There's a niche for them.
There's a
they're kind
nuance.
of an Amazon
There's a nuance
Okay.
to that
church.
discussion. I
Okay.
think you have one axis of what we would call grace and truth. And I think you have another axis of practicality of ministry and options, if you will. And so I think there's very rarely you're going to find churches that are like right in the middle of both those axes. So you're not going to find someone. You may find someone in the middle of the grace and truth, but they don't have as much to offer. Maybe they're not just smaller. They'll have the mass of what maybe a larger church would have to offer. And then sometimes a larger church has to kind of lean one way or the other just to keep the ship going one direction. So you see these two axes and how they kind of play out of like the amount of the quantity and the quality what you have to offer, and I think this grace and truth kind of line also plays out in that. And I think that, in our experience at Riverbend, that's what's kind of, it is unique in this, that it is a large church trying to find that middle, wrestling along that journey of trying to find that middle. When we have this discussion, I love what you guys have said about the extremes of it. The niches, the riches is, there's so much of the
Are we gonna
finance.
steal that one?
Yeah,
Riches
there's
and the
so much
niches?
that I think church, some of the extremes of this is driven by finances, and that's difficult for the punk rock guy in me. Is like, there's no purity in that, there's no grace and truth in that. That's just the dollar, and I want to puke, I just want to but that's where I end up coming back in my own grace. That people are getting something out of that, like you just said. That's redeemable for me. I relate a lot of this kind of talk to, this is probably 1996. Man, I'm getting old. Kind of had left the church, came back, was like really like, doing this, but it was very extreme in the sense that it had to be done the way that I thought it had to be done, and very like rock and roll and somewhat extreme, to be honest with you. And that would include musical styles and ideas and cultures and the whole thing. So I go to this, because I like music, I go to this huge thing called Spirit West Coast, which is this thing that started in the West Coast with all these bands playing. It was supposed to be like their Christian Woodstock. And I was like, I'm going to go see some of these bands that I want, but those other ones over there, they just suck. I'm not doing it. But I'm at this thing, and I'm kind of forced, because there's show after show going on back and forth. I'm waiting for the next one. I'm listening to this. And after about 2 days of this, I started to realize something. I was like, oh my gosh, that's a different musical style. But the heart of that person is the same as like the hard rock guy that I really like. That pop music or that whatever, that kind of thing that I was like, oh, that's like Amy Grant music. Like,
Hey,
rock and roll
hey,
kidding me.
hey,
I know, I'm sorry. See, this is where
Hey.
Kevin and I go at it.
Amy Grant was all right back then.
Right.
Not sure I listened to her now, but
Right, for sure. But
pretty
that was
all
the
right
stuff
back
that I
then.
railed against. But it was a very much for me like this awakening of, oh my gosh, I've been focusing on all the outside stuff of this. And grace started to allow me to see the heart of people that I had never, as a young man, kind of like even tried to embrace. It was so adversarial, even within the Christian world. And it was something that really, I think that's carried me even through these kinds of experiences as we talk about this. I have difficulties with some of the churches. I do. I look at it and I go, and my skin crawls. But then I keep coming back to this place of like, okay, if I'm really going to hold this grace and truth thing, even with the most extreme ones, that like I'm a fake if I can't give them the grace that I would expect
Without
them to give
question.
me.
Absolutely.
But that has been a hard, difficult journey to get to.
Well,
that
what a
place.
brilliant foreshadow to what you're going to do in a couple of weeks talking about politics. Because this tribalism, that we live right now, so that's a preview for a couple of weeks.
It
to
is.
Talk about
It
that
is. And
crazy
I hope
world.
we get there. I mean, that's kind of what we want to do too.
Well,
so.
and isn't it the grace component that is what attracts people
I think
to
it
our
is.
faith? Isn't it when churches go out and do those acts of grace, when we feed others, when we do it's not when we're, the churches that are knocking on doors, or when the
Right.
Hare Krishnas used to
Right.
corner you in the airports if you're my age. It's not those events. It is the grace that attracts people who want to be part of that grace and who see that grace in somebody like the two of you and go, that guy's really saying, I want some of that.
And you.
And you.
I want some of that.
Right now.
Remember we started with self-care and self-grace.
It's,
Right.
Love
it's
your
funny
own.
though, Jim. I got to interject this. There's two things. First of all, being accosted at an airport, I was actually, I guess, proselytized might be the right word. San Francisco Airport. Have you guys ever been there?
Yep.
What's the group that gets you there?
Don't know.
The
Not hard,
Church
not
of
hard.
John Coltrane.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
didn't know that.
There's actually a Church of John Coltrane. You're like, as a musician, I'm like, I was almost tempted to say,
I want to be in
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I'm in. Kevin's like, I'm in.
Really, John? What do we do?
What are we singing?
Do we just listen to his just riffing? What do we do? No, I can't worship John Coltrane. And the other thing is, Jim, I think there are people that, for whatever reason, they feel like they've had almost too much grace in their life. And they're going to be, this could be like a magnet of, no, I want the truth. I want hard truth, and I want it now.
Right.
Sure.
So most people should be attracted by grace, but I've just been astounded that there's so
Depends
many
where you're
are
in your
not as
journey.
much.
And again, that's the beauty of God, is that he gives all of us these stories of how we came so we can relate to other people, and it's the differences which really make us all stronger.
Here's how this plays out for me. I'll kind of close this up with this. You're talking about that grace that kind of binds us together. COVID happens. We're going to go feed people because that's what we feel like God's called us to do, put things in place to do that. Right now, there's 9 churches that we partner with in Austin that are all helping together. I mean, Austin Baptist Church, Hill Country, Stone's been a part of this. Like, I can go on. There's a long list. Bethel, like, these guys have been amazing. I mean, and I would tell you right now, the amount of people who need food, need help, need some serious grace, Riverbend can't do it by itself. It's really not even possible. So the beauty of that many churches coming together, and there's no talk about who's right and who's wrong. There's no talk about all that kind of stuff. It's just simply the bare, like, I'm going to have grace with people. We're going to love them. And that, I keep having hope in that. That brings me back to the place I go, yeah, that's a little weird. That's a little weird, but man,
Sure.
God can still do this. I think God can still even do that in a political world that looks really desperate and kind of hopeless. So listen, thank you guys for being here tonight. I loved having you here. I think thank you. These guys online have loved having you
Did
here
we
too.
break the internet?
We probably do. Who knows what we're doing with that?
Hey, real quick, Sarah Brandon said hello.
Oh, thank you.
So
Hello, Sarah.
good.
And I just want to make sure we get our 2 takeaways. Riches and niches,
Riches and niches.
and 100% each of the cocktail. 100 100
100.
Which is basically a shot and a chaser.
I just want to make sure we
In a religious way.
In a religious
In a religious way. There's Riverbend. Here we go, So, hey, thank you guys for joining us tonight. Thanks again. This has really been awesome. Join us in 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to have Immerse. We got hymn sing tomorrow night. Services this weekend, 9:30 and 11. Love to have you join us. If you're interested in serving in some of these places, go on our website. There's lots of places where you can act selflessly, is what Bill was talking about. And then next week we'll have Immerse, and then 2 weeks we're going to have a discussion about politics. So hopefully it goes better than the debates. So anyway, thanks guys for watching. We'll see you soon.